Hello and welcome to the 11th chapter of the course. In this chapter, we will look at the post-flop adjustments we need to be making when we cover or when we are covered by our opponents. First, a few words about how this is supposed to work. So in normal ICM situations, what happens is that the shorter stack, the cover stack, has a fairly high risk premium because he really doesn't want to bust. This covering stack has a fairly smaller risk premium because he's at risk of busting, but it still has some risk premium because, as we know, in ICM, losing chips is worse than actually winning chips. The chips you lose cost more than the chips you win. In PSKOs, there is always some form of ICM where you don't necessarily have a positive risk premium, but the covering stack has a negative risk premium. So he's just more incentivized to put money in when he covers the other stack. And this is reflected in the post-flop solutions as well, where basically what happens is that the stack that covers has a negative risk premium, so just wants to start putting more money in and betting a higher frequency and potentially using bigger sizings and going thinner for value and so on, whereas the covered stack wants to be playing a bit more passively. We need to remember that the covered stack doesn't have a positive risk premium. He's not at any sort of ICM risk. So his strategy doesn't necessarily become tighter because of a fear of busting, just that the fold equity is reduced because our opponent needs less equity to make calls because of his negative risk premium. The way we solve postflop is by importing the HRC situation into PioSolver. So what happens is that the risk premium is from HRC and then integrated into our postflop strategy. Whether this negative risk premium concept actually accurately reflects the benefit of knocking someone out and claiming his bounty is a bit unclear. I can see reasons why it wouldn't be, such as all the future review we're gaining by doubling up and covering more on the table, and the potential of winning the tournament and therefore gaining the whole bounty, and generally how our strategy changes when our bounty increases. But overall, it is the best we have right now, so this is what we will go for. I have prepared 3 different situations for you today. And the first one we will be looking at is hijack opening of 40 big blinds and the big blind defending of a very similar stack size. I run first with the hijack covering and then the hijack being covered. For this first example, I also gave them the exact same ranges regardless of who covers whom. As we know, if the hijack is covering, then he would be opening a bit wider, whereas if the hijack was covered, he would have to be a bit tighter and the big blind would be able to defend a wider range. But just for this first example, I gave them the same ranges, regardless of if the hijack is covering or covered, so that we can clearly see the differences between being covered and covering. Let me show you how we import an HRC output into PioSolver first. So we have our scenario here, where under the gun, or whichever position hijack in this case, is raising. So we click that node, and then we need to select a node where we go post-flop heads up. PioSolver can only solve for 2 players in the pot, and we need to be closing the action. So for example, if after hijack opening, I click, let's say, small blind 3 betting, well, now I can export that to PioSolver. It doesn't work because this node just doesn't exist. We don't have a post-flop situation here. So what I actually need to do is select a decision point which closes the action and we go post-flop. You can see this provides just an error. So when hijack is opening and the big blind is calling, then we can export this into PioSolver. You can click export selected node to Pio under hand. And then we save this in whichever name and whichever place we want. What we need to do after that is open PioSolver and click Tools, then import ICM model from HRC. This pop-up will open, and then we click Open, and we select the file that we saved. Once we do that, once we end up selecting our file, then this will fill up, and after we click OK, we are then taken into the post-flop tree configuration where the ICM model is in effect, the ICM structure is properly set up based on the HRC solution. And then we can choose the flop and the sizings and everything we usually do on PioSolver. This is usable for PSKOs, but also for regular ICM stuff we want to be checking out. Like if we run in ICM final table sim on HRC, then we can import it in PySolver to see the postflop action. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's jump into the numbers. I forgot to mention that this is our usual tournament where it's 530 buy-in, 25k starting stack. Everyone has a starting bounty. The big blind is 500. So and a starting bounty is worth around 13.5 big blinds. So hijack has 14, his bounty is worth 13.5. Same goes for when the hijack is covering the big blind. Let's first have a look at the ranges, just so we have an idea of what we're talking about. So in positions range, hijack's range is supposed to look like this. Again, reminder, it's the same ranges whether it's the hijack covering or the big blind covering. So 27.3%. And for the big blind, it's something like this. So 75-ish%. Right. Now, the main work we will be doing here is from this document. Let me actually make it a little bit bigger. So a lot of information here, I know. On the left side, we can see the flops. I ran a small subset of 49 flops for this. Then here we can see the leading frequency from the big blind. First, when the hijack covers, and then when the big blind covers. And then we have the in-position actions. First, when the hijack covers, whether the hijack c-bets 25%, 50%, or pot, or checks back. And then for when the big blind covers. First, we want to have a look at the leading. So we are focusing on these columns here, the green and blue columns. As said, here we have the action when the hijack covers, and then here when the big blind covers. And we can see that overall, there just isn't supposed to be much leading from the big blind. However, we do have some leading on the very middling connected boards when the big blind covers. When the hijack covers, as you can see, there's basically no leading. The biggest leading is like 12% on this 865 rainbow texture. But when the big blind covers, the leading goes up to 50%. I only allowed for a small sizing lead. We generally don't see big sizings lead almost ever. And yeah, we can see that it's just not really a thing. It happens for a fairly low frequency on this very specific 865 kind of board. So at least for these positions in this stack size, we don't really need to worry about leading that much. So now let's get to in-position c-betting. Again, on the red is when hijack covers, and the yellow is when the big blind covers. So the main thing that we can see is that when the hijack covers, there is very little checking. There is 7% checking in total, whereas when the big blind covers, there is 18% checking. So it is a sizable difference. Then we can also see that there tend to be larger sizings when the hijack covers. Maybe not necessarily the pot sizing, but the half pot sizing you can see is greatly increased and used just much, much more. So what we would expect? Less checking and more bigger sizings, the natural evolution, I guess, of the strategy. Right. So let's look at the boards for each category. First, we have the ace-high boards. Now, we can see that ace-high boards, unless there is a bad pair card like the 6 on a6-6, where the hijack gets to check a lot regardless of whether he's the covering or the covered stack, they are pretty much going to be range bets regardless of who is covering. As you can see, like all of them are basically range bets. However, when the hijack is covering the big blind, we do see a switch towards bigger sizings. First, the half pot sizing is used very, very often, even on the driest ace-high boards. We actually see almost no small sizings on ace-highs when the hijack is covering. The only exception would be the paired board like ace-a7. So a board like ace-4 deuce, for example, goes from being a mostly small sizing bet to now being a pretty much exclusively half pot bet when the hijack covers. For this, we will be comparing the trees side to side so that we can better visually see the differences. On the left side, we have the big blind covering, and on the right side, we have the hijack covering. If you forget which one is which, you can see on the title. The left one says covered, which means that the hijack is covered, and the right one says covering, which means that the hijack is covering. The board we mentioned is ace-4 deuce, so let's open that. We have ace-4 deuce, deuce. Here we go. And so, of course, no leading. And here we can see the flop strategy. So left side, as we said, when the big blind is the covering stack and hijack is covered, it's still a range bet, but a lot of small sizing. On the other hand, we can now see only half pot when the hijack is covering. Why does this happen? Well, this is overall going to be a fairly good board for the hijack. Yeah, he's going to have 62% equity. So with the added benefit of the bounty, he's just allowed to push more this equity. Against the half pot bet, if we look at the responses, when the big blind is covering, he folds quite a bit more than when he's covered. The raising is about the same frequency, but we can see the fold goes from folding 48% when the big blind is covering to folding 55% when the big blind is covered by the hijack. Which are the first hands that start folding? Well, these are going to be the gachos. So we can see when the big blind is covering, king 5 off and like king 3 off, queen 3 off, jack 3 off, these hands aren't really folding. The gut shot is just very incentivized to call and try to hit the miracle outer. Whereas when the big blind is covered by the hijack, then these kind of gut shots are folding a lot more and are basically way closer to being indifferent. This appears to be the main difference. Then also we have some more folding with something like 7-5 off, which is always calling when the big blind is covering. So basically what we can see is that the big blind tends to chase draws a little bit more when he's covering the hijack and can go for the bounty. Let's have a look at what happens on the turn. So first let's put a complete brick out there, which would be something like the 9 of hearts. Looks as much of a brick as you can get. No leading in either case. And this is a board where the hijack just wants to barrel very, very aggressively, regardless of if he's covering or if he's covered. The reason that we see these very similar frequencies, regardless of the bounty, is that if you recall, the big blind was continuing wider when he was covering, so the big blind's turn range is actually wider in this case. So we have, on one hand, the hijack isn't incentivized to bluff much because he's covered, but on the other hand, the big blind's range is wider, so he just has way more natural folds. All these naked 3x and 5x now have to just immediately fold against the bet, whereas when the big blind is covered, then he doesn't call these hands. And here we have one of the most important concepts of postflop BSKO. And that is that the ranges on future streets after the flop actually don't change all that much, regardless of who is covering whom. And the reason this happens is that, on one hand, the covering stack is incentivized to put more money and start betting because of the higher risk premium, but the covered stack's range is tighter because, again, it has no real incentive to call wide. So this disincentivizes the covering stack from betting. And the vice versa is also true. The covered stack on the turn doesn't really want to barrel as much and bluff as much because he is covered. But on the other hand, the covering stack's flop continuing range is going to be much wider, as we saw. So then this again pushes in position or the covered stack to bet more because of the immediate auto folds in the covering stack's range. And we can see this very clearly that the betting frequency on the turn is pretty much identical. We actually see a bit of a move towards a bigger sizing when the hijack is covered. And that's because of all the immediate auto folds that the big blind will have. So for example, against the 75%, which is the most commonly used sizing, we can see that actually the big blind is folding more when he's covering the hijack. And that's because he just has way more garbage in his range. Hands like all this king 5 off and all this offsuit 3x, which aren't there at such a high frequency when the big blind is covered. Then the same is true for the river. If we put a brick out there on the river, then we can see that the betting frequencies, regardless of if the hijack is covering or covered, are pretty much the same. We actually see a bit less bluffing when the hijack is covering, and the value range is about the same. The reason we see this less bluffing is because, again, the big blind's range is a little bit tighter here. As for value, yes, when the hijack is covering, he wants to go for the bounty, but jamming, for example, ace-8 or ace-5 is just going to be way too thin against a fairly strong range already. As for bluff catching, so here we do see a bit of a difference. When the big blind is covering, he ends up calling a bit of a higher frequency. For example, you can see a hand like 9-5 off is always calling, and like 9-3 suited is always calling. But like in a bit of a higher frequency with this king 4 off, king 4 suited kind of hands. It's not a big difference, but it's somewhat there. Okay, so this is it about ace-4 deuce, where we have a lot of shifts towards the bigger sizing when the hijack covers. Same is true for something like H5 deuce. Again, we can see half pot is the go-to sizing. And then we have a flop like Ace Jack 10 with 3 Broadways. So when the hijack is covered, we can see half pot is the main sizing by far. Whereas when the hijack is covering, now we see a lot more pot sizing. I know I pronounce the word differently, but it's just so I can put emphasis on who is covering who, because there can be some confusion when the words are so similar. All right, so pot sizing is going to be the main sizing. And let's have a look at this board as well. We have Ace Jack 10 and Ace Jack 10. Right, so again, the thought process here is similar, that in position has 71% equity or close to, therefore just wants to push this equity more when he's covering. The response against the pot sizing looks like this. So we can see two things here. First, when the big blind is covering, he is folding quite a bit less against the pot sizing, even though the range that is betting pot is going to be stronger because it's a lower frequency. The big blind is folding less because of the bounty aspect, because he covers and if he wants to go for the bounty. So for example, we see slightly more calling with these offsuit ace-x. Then we also see flush draws, for example, are never folding. Without the bounty incentive, these flush draws are basically indifferent against the pot sizing. Whereas with the bounty, they are kind of never folding. Then we also see a hand like, say, Queen 9 isn't really folding when he's covering, because hitting the straight has a lot more added value. Then the second thing that we see is actually some more jamming. And this happens mostly with the draw. I guess one other calling hand is the Jack-X with the backdoor flush draw, which is folding when the big blind is covered, but always calling when the big blind is covering, because the backdoor flush draw, again, much more incentive. So as said, we see more jamming. So this happens with the strong draws. We can see, for example, the combo draws are much more incentivized to get it in when the big blind is covering. Then also a bit more bluffing with something like, say, not bluffing, a bit of a wider get it in with value with something like Jack 10. As you can see, Jack 10 is always calling when the big blind is covered, but always getting it in when the big blind is covering. And yeah, so I said bluffing, but we actually don't really see any like stone cold bluffs. All in hands are kind of semi-bluffs with very strong draws. Against the half pot sizing, the response looks like this. So again, same thing. The big blind is just calling more when he's covering, and especially with these kind of Jack-X backdoor flush draw hands. In terms of raising, that is also increased a lot. And again, this mainly comes from the combo draws, but really benefit from getting it in. These, for example, Queen X or Spades, you can see are raising much more when the big blind is covering. And the value range, yeah, slightly expanded again, like some more Ace 10 off raising, some more Jack 10 off raising. Seems in line with what was happening against the pot sizing. After pot and call, and if we put out a brick, we can again see that the 10 strategies are almost identical. The same sizing is chosen, and the ranges also just look very, very close with each other. We do have slightly more betting when the hijack is covered. And again, that has to do with the amount of continues the big blind has against pot. He continues wider, so we can bet a little bit more. Like, for example, we can see A7 can actually value bet when the hijack is covered, because the big blind will continue a bunch with the draws and still has a lot of, this like of Queen Jack off kind of hands, and even the Queen 9 offs that always call. So we again see that no real difference on the turn, and if anything, the hijack gets to value bet wider when he is covered, because the big blind continues more with straight draws and Jack-X backdoor flush on the flop. Otherwise, the betting composition looks very, very similar. Okay, now moving to king high boards. This would be over here. We can again see the checking has been reduced to 0. The hijack is supposed to do some checking when he's covered, especially on the very locked boards, like say King Queen X or some King Jack X, and even on something like King 9-7, which is this like very middling, very connected board. However, when the hijack is covering, then this need to check back is vanished. Let's have a look at one of those. Let's look at King 9-7 first. So King 9-7 and king 9-7. No leading. And yeah, we can see when the hijack is covered, there's supposed to be a 32.5% checkback. When the hijack is covering, there is no checkback. Also, the pot sizing is slightly reduced when the hijack is covering. And again, that's because he wants to bet more of his range, so the very large sizing is reduced. The response against the small sizing looks like this. So we can again see that the check raise is very similar, but the big blind is calling a bit more when he is covering. And the main continues will come from some of those suited backdoor flush draw hands, which can make the nuts. In terms of like actual pairs, almost no pair is supposed to fall. So yeah, it's just going to be those suited backdoor flush draw hands that continue at a higher or a pure frequency. Let's look at the response against pot bet as well, I guess, where again we have a fairly similar thing. When the big blind is covering, we can see he continues a little bit more, but when the big blind is covered, then he falls a bit more, but also can raise a bit wider, because in position will continue more against the raise. We see then the same kind of reoccurring concept here. So we had some checking on king 9-7, which we see is now completely diminished. And then let's also look at something like king queen deuce. Here we are. And we have king queen deuce and king queen deuce. Again, no real leading. And we can see that when covered, again, the hijack has to develop a checkback range, whereas it's pretty much a range bet when the hijack is covering. The response against the small sizing looks like this. So very similar thing where the big blind continues slightly more when he's covering and also gets to check raise slightly more as well, as we can see here. This makes sense. The difference isn't going to be much bigger because when the big blind is covering, as we said, the hijack has a checkback range. So therefore, the c-betting range is a bit tighter and stronger, so the big blind can't make any ridiculous adjustments. On the turn, if we put out a complete brick, we can see that the big blind is actually supposed to have some leads when he is covering. And this mostly comes from some king x, which benefit a lot from targeting the queen x that in position has. And then also some of the, as we can see, this kind of like 10-9, jack-9, jack-10 kind of hands, which aren't very excited to face a second barrel. But it's a fairly small frequency, not much to worry about. So on the turn, we can see the same thing again, where the betting frequencies are very, very similar. You can see the checkback is 58% when the big blind is covering, and 58, again, 59.7 when the big blind is covered. So very small differences. One thing that we see here is that the value range is slightly expanded when the hijack is covering. Because he wants to get the big blind bounty, you can see something like king 8 is more incentivized to bet. Can go slightly wider for value. But again, it's not some huge, super significant difference. The main sizing is going to be the overbet in both cases. So let's look at the response. And as you can expect, when the big blind is covered, he folds slightly more. When he's covering, he calls like 1%. 1% more. So again, almost negligible difference. And on another brick, let's look at the value range on the river. So yeah, in this scenario, we do see an expanded value range from the hijack when he's covering. This is a bit of a clearer run out for value bets. So for example, hands like king 9 suited, king 10 suited, even king 8 suited in some cases is value jamming when the hijack is covering, but not value jamming when the hijack is covered. Again, this is a byproduct of, first, the bounty. Obviously, the hijack wants to get the big blind's bounty. And then also, the big blind is not going to be folding as much when he's covering, so the bluffs are reduced, and therefore the value range has to be a bit more limited as well. Against the jam, this is the big blind's response. So because the value jam range is wider when the hijack is covering, the big blind also calls a bit more. For example, king 8 suited is, we can see, looks like this. Some bluff catching is reduced, but overall, very, very very similar frequencies. We're talking about 1% difference. So once again, we can see that the strategies after the flop aren't really different, with the exception of hijack value betting a bit wider on a cleaner run out. Then we have the queen high boards, which are here. And those were pretty much range bets regardless of who is covering who, with the exception of something like queen 7-6, which is middling and connected, so the hijack had to check back a bunch when covered. But when the hijack is covering, we can again pretty much go for pure range bet. We again see some shift towards bigger sizings. For example, on these monotone boards, now we can see half pot is being used by the hijack, whereas when covered, you can see the smaller sizing is preferred. But other than that, the strategies do look fairly similar here. Just again, no checking for the covered stack. For the jack high boards, very, very similar concept. The checking gets reduced. Even something like jack 8-8, the hijack is pretty much range betting. And the sizings shift a bit more towards bigger sizings. Even on a fairly dry board like jack 8 deuce, we can see the hijack when covering is going for half pot and pot. Whereas when the hijack is covered, there is a lot more smaller sizing happening. Other than that, we don't really see many big differences. 10 high boards play out following the same thought process. We have slightly more large sizings and basically no checking. Then for these positions, finally, we have the low card boards, which are fairly interesting. So again, we can see the checking frequency is reduced a lot when the hijack is covering. Then also we again see a shift towards larger sizings. Let's look at some boards here. So first, let's look at some 9-3 deuce kind of texture. So we have 9-3 deuce and 9-3 deuce. Here we go. So very close to range bet in either case, but we do see some slightly bigger sizings when the hijack is covered. You can see pot and half pot are just being used more. The response against the small sizing looks very, very similar. The big blind folds less when covered and raises a bit more, but I think it's all pretty much in line with what we've seen so far. Continues more with raises with some backdoor flush draw kind of hands, which can make the nuts. For example, jack 5 of diamonds, we can see is never folding when the big blind is covering because of the backdoor nut situations, whereas jack 5 of diamonds is always folding when the big blind is covered. So we have 9-3 deuce, then we have 9-6 deuce. I think this is also interesting because of the amount of checking back that is nullified. So 9-6 deuce and 9-6 deuce. So left side, when the hijack is covered, we can see a very polar kind of betting strategy where he checks a lot and mostly uses pot sizing. When the hijack is covering, we see less of a polar strategy, with the small and middling sizings being by far the more commonly used ones. Against the small sizing, this is the big blind's response. So again, they look fairly similar in both cases, because when the hijack is covered, he bets a stronger range, so the big blind can really check raise too much or continue too much. Same goes for the response against the pot sizing. You can see the big blind continues slightly more when he's covering, but it's nothing too crazy. As for the bottom value bets, we can see that. So if we give a brick on the turn, which would be maybe a 3, well, it's not really a brick, I guess, because of all the straights. Maybe a deuce, no. Not many bricks here, are there? A jack isn't really a brick, but we can do that. So yeah, the jack is pretty much always going to be a range bet for the hijack because of how good the card is for him. Maybe, yeah. I guess we can't have too many bricks here, but we can see what the river looks like. So this 7% bet in both cases. And we can see when the big blind is covered, he ends up doing a lot more jamming on the jack, even jamming a lot of 9x, as we can see, because hijack is just priced in to call with pretty much everything. All the draws, gut shots, even some ace highs. On the other hand, when the hijack is covered, then he bets a bit of a stronger range on the turn, and then also will not call as much. So on the river, now we can come up with a brick. I guess now a 3 is kind of a brick. if we look at the value ranges, they are very, very close. When the hijack is covered, he bluffs a bit less with ace highs. But yeah, in terms of the value range, it looks like queen 9 is always the bottom with 10-9. Yeah, so 10-9 is mixing in some jams when the hijack's covering, but always checking back when the hijack's covered. So, again, very, very similar strategies after the flop. The main differences come on the flop. One thing worth looking at here is when the turn is a sort of connected card, like if it is, let's say, a 5, what happens to the leading range from the big blind? And the big blind just gets to lead in both cases, because after calling the flop pot-sized bet, then on the turn his range is just very well condensed around the 5 and these middling cards. Same goes if it is, I guess, a board pair like the deuce. Yeah, on the deuce we see a lot of leading from the big blind again because of the deuce 6 advantage, but not necessarily because of that. Also because now a 6 can start value betting because in position just has many, many complete bricks here. As you can see, all these offsuit broadways. We have a lot of reduced checking even on the very connected boards. Like we can see this kind of like 8-7-4 textures. The big blind was supposed to be the hijack was supposed to be checking 43% when covered, but only checking 23% when covering. But for the most part, we see the same adjustments here. We see the hijack doesn't really check when he's covering, but after the flop, the ranges are very, very similar in both cases, because when the big blind is covering, he continues a bit more, so his turn range is wider, but when the big blind is covered, his turn range is tighter, so how much the hijack bets doesn't change between the two situations. And as said, I think this is a very important takeaway from this concept. Now we can move on to the next scenario, which is button opens and big blind defense, and the effective stack size is 30. So on one hand, the big blind will have 30 big blinds and covered by the big blind. On the other hand, the button will have 45 big blinds and covering the big blind has 30. So the effective stack size is always 30. On one hand, the button is covering. On the other hand, the big blind is covering. And we'll look at the same things we looked at for this position.